Speak to Jake Wallis Simons, Deputy Editor of the Jewish Chronicle, who joins us from Winchester, not Westminster, Winchester. Jake, thanks for your time this evening, really appreciate it.
Hi, Colin.
There will be people listening to what I had to say. They will say, well, look, you're extrapolating far too much from one particular incident.
Well, I think that you are right to indicate that these single incidents knit together to form a greater narrative. And that narrative is one that leads to increasing levels of horror until it leads eventually to the ultimate horror that mankind's ever experienced, which was the Holocaust 75, 80 years ago. I think that it's important to bear in mind that, as the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs put it, the former chief rabbi, that the hatred that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. It begins with somebody getting punched in the street, somebody getting his kippah knocked off, racial slurs becoming the norm, and all of this being sort of treated with as a sort of second-class racism. It's not really as big a deal as it would be if they were of another ethnic minority. And from that point, it can escalate to a greater normalization of hatred, as we saw in Nazi Germany. Taunts and everyday abuse became systematized and part of legislation and an accepted part of a modern German state. And then it escalated and escalated to become mass murder. And I think that from the point of view of Britain as a whole, what begins with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. I mean, we see that you pointed out in your talk just now that this new threat is coming mainly from radical Islamists. Well, Jews are by far from the only target of radical Islamists. I mean, if you look across the Middle East and North Africa, Christians are being targeted horrendously by radical Islam. And let's not forget that the majority of the victims of radical Islam are actually Muslims of different sects or with slightly different beliefs or theology. And so it's indisputable, really, that what begins with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. And it's clear to see how it can escalate from one incident, two incidents, a few, gradually, slowly but surely becoming normalized and leading to the sorts of horrors that we have seen within the lifetimes of people living today.
Jake, I take a walk in central London that regularly takes me past a synagogue festooned with CCTV cameras, which is the painful reality of the experience in recent years. On the one hand, it's daunting and depressing. On the other hand, it reminds us actually that there is there are the things there now that can capture and record events the likes of which we saw last week, the knocking unconscious for no reason of a 64-year-old man simply walking down the street. That we can obtain that footage, it can be widely shared, and this can be brought to the attention it deserves.
Well, I mean, you're right. It's a sad reality of being Jewish in the modern world is that you have lots and lots of security to contend with. In fact, there's more security around synagogues in Britain and in the United States than there is in Israel itself. And you're right. We do have modern tools of surveillance and ways to pursue attackers and bring them to justice. But sadly, this doesn't seem to be making any difference with regard to the frequency with which anti-Semitic attacks take place. And all too often, social media, which comes from the same sort of technological advances as surveillance and modern policing techniques, is responsible for the spreading of anti-Semitic videos. We've seen, anti-Semitic attacks being filmed and shared. Sometimes it can pour petrol on the flames rather than work to overcome them.
We can't speculate, obviously, for legal reasons and moral reasons on the video we've just been playing again. But we can talk a little bit, I think, about what we saw earlier this year, Jake, which was, whether it was, in quotes, low-level stuff, people driving around in cars, waving Palestinian flags. I mentioned that seemingly innocuous phrase, from the river to the sea, which actually, when you pass it, is deeply chilling and depressing. But there was clearly a connection between anti-Semitism in Britain and elsewhere and events in Israel early this year.
That's right. I mean, I think this is an important area to disentangle, really, because Jews previously were hated for their religion during medieval times and so forth. Then they were hated for their race under Nazism, and now they're hated for their nation state. And it simply isn't the case that anti-Semitism is produced by the existence of Israel. And if you think about the Holocaust, the worst modern genocide known to mankind happened before Israel existed. And so anti-Semitism isn't caused by Israel. It's true that at the moment, the main focus of anti-Semitism seems to be through the prism of Israel. But this idea that Israel causes anti-Semitism or even exacerbates it is misguided. Israel is a necessity for Jews to defend themselves in their own state, and that was the reason why it was founded after the Holocaust. And it just puts the whole thing upside down to say that Israel is the cause of anti-Semitism, because that this is the only way that Jews have hit upon to try to defend themselves, and it's quite effective in many ways. And so I think that the whole thing is a bit of a red herring to blame anti-Semitism somehow on Israel and say, well, if Israel wasn't doing X or Y, then there wouldn't be these attacks. In reality, there would be.
Jake, I know in stuff you've written, you've been very critical in the past of Labour politicians for not damning anti-Semitism quickly enough or powerfully enough. I quoted that tweet from Diane Abbott there, in which she seemed to be very powerfully condemning what had happened. How reflective is she of what's happening within the Labour movement on anti-Semitism? And actually, just moving it away from politics a little bit, there are questions here, aren't there, I imagine, for the Metropolitan Police as well, and other institutions which have to deal with what's actually happening on the streets?
Well, I think what you're talking about is anti-Semitism on the left, and both in terms of party politics, but also more broadly, culturally. And we have seen in recent years the emergence of what's been called the Red-Green Alliance, this sort of strange sort of overlapping of interests between the left, particularly the radical left, and the Islamists, who hold, on the face of it, entirely different worldviews, the two of them, but they had this sort of this strange overlap when it comes to attitudes towards colonialism and so on and so forth. I think that in the Labour Party at the moment, there is a battle going on. There's been a battle going on for the soul of the Labour Party for a long time, and it's not over and shows no sign of being over. And in terms of the left more broadly, I think that the problem of the Red-Green Alliance, which was so obvious during the Corbyn years, hasn't gone away. It's just sort of moved away from the public eye a little bit because the leadership of the party has changed, and so the general feeling of things has changed, and the sort of issues that the media focuses on has moved. But I think that the problem is still there, and we really do need to confront, as a country, the threat of a new kind of theocratic fascism, which has no place on the left or the right or anywhere in British politics or the culture of the West. And it's something that we need to take far more seriously in confronting than we have done so far, particularly on the left.
Jake, got to leave it there. Jake Wallis Simons joining us from Winchester. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Colin.